Okay, time to put together a burst pack. First thing we're going to start with is this lever, the one that catches the counting wheel. You want to hold it this way and make sure that both of these legs point down. Obviously, if one points down, they're both going to point down. I have heard that on some of the packs these are different lengths, and that the shorter one goes down, the longer one goes up. These two are exactly the same. The ones on the other pack are the same. I've never actually encountered one that's been different, but if you do have one where one's shorter, the shorter one supposedly goes down. Again, this is where I was saying that this wants to bind up and not be fun. It's going to be really hard to show you this, but you can see in there, you can actually see that shiny spot where the spring kind of rests. So just set it down in place. And then, if we can get it close, get a punch in there. That way we can line it up. And now you can see down in there where the spring's resting on the shelf and the other leg is resting here. This is the smaller of the two pins. It's that little 3/32. And now we need to line that up. You can see that's a lot of spring tension. So get it lined up just so. Once you can get that pin in there and get it started, leave that punch in. Don't pull it out. If you pull it out, it's going to want to get crooked again on you, but you can basically push the punch out with the pin. And now we're almost there. Now we just got to push it down a little bit. And you can push that right in with your finger. That's nice and flush on both sides. The next part that goes in is that funky little lever that you have to push to release the safety. I cannot remember what this is called. And before you put it in, that other leg rests right here, right in this spot. So when you're going to put this in, before you even put it in, make sure you hook that over to make things a little bit easier for yourself. This is not the best tool to be using for that. The tiny little flathead would have worked a lot better, but I didn't think to have one right now. Maybe I can do it with this. It's a lot harder to do when you're trying to film it. There, now we've got it hooked. You can see it right in there, it's hooked. We'll get this lined up. Get the other pin in there. You don't need to hammer them in, just wiggle it till you get it lined up and she'll drop right in place. Okay, the next thing that we have to do is get that spring that's resting down inside up onto here. And you can do that by taking a hook tool, grabbing the edge of that spring, and get it up on there. And now we should have spring tension both on that piece, which we do, and on that latch, which we do. So the next thing we're going to do is put together our trigger. Now this is that little latch that I was showing you earlier, has a separate spring, and that this pin has to go in a certain way. So remember to make sure that that part with the groove is on the left side of the trigger, because that trigger tension spring is what rides on it. So also something to note, on this latch you can see it's like a shelf sticking out. When you go to put this together, if you're not careful, you can actually put this together with that below, like so, and you'll have no spring tension and this piece can't move. When you put this together, you have to make sure that you put that little shelf on top, like so. So take your pin and just start it just through. Take your spring. You'll notice that one leg is much longer than the other. The longer leg actually goes down and the shorter leg goes up. Make sure your pin isn't too far forward or you won't be able to get the spring in. Drop it in place and just slide the pin through. You may have to wiggle a little bit. There we go. And this should move, which it does. And like we were saying before, you can't just push this up in because it gets in the way of this bar. So you have to rotate it in there. But we need our trigger return spring. And remember, the shorter leg fits on here in that groove. And we'll set that in place. Okay. Now, this hook on this latch is where that pin needs to go behind. So when we put this in, you want to make sure that that pin is pretty much even, otherwise it won't hook on that. Make sure we have our trigger return spring on, and it's kind of hard to see in there, but it needs to get past that and get rotated in. But yet you got to be careful, because there's that trigger over travel stop up here. Now you can see that it is behind that hook. Now that hook, that's that one I was showing over here for the counting wheel. Every time you pull the trigger, when it resets, it moves to allow that counting wheel to move. So now that we've got that in, we need to line it up, but it's a little too high. There we go. Rotate it down, and we'll get that lined up so we can put our pin in to start holding it in place. And you always want to put this pin from the left side. Functionally, it doesn't make a difference, but the reason that it is easier to do it from the left side is, and you can see that, put it in just enough to hold it and still have room to get the sear in there later. But the reason you want to do that is, if you put it in from the right side, all this spring tension on the left side from the trigger return spring is going to want to twist things and bind them up and make it harder to move this pin through, and it's already going to be hard enough as it is. By putting it on this side, you have your pivot right where the spring is, so it's hopefully, in theory, a little bit less painful to do. And of course, hook our trigger return spring. Make sure it's all the way on. And as you can see in there, it is. So we have trigger. Pin's lined up where it should be. And now that we have that trigger return spring on, you can actually get a little bit clearer shot right there where that pin is hooking on there. So now we need to drop our sear in. And like always, I pointed out earlier, there is that spring-loaded little plunger in there. And sometimes, and you can see it's not a lot of spring tension, but that pin is trying to overcome that when it gets driven through. So it can be a little bit of a bear sometimes. Make sure also that you put in the sear the correct way, because you could accidentally put it in the wrong way. If you put it in the wrong way, this is going to sit on top of the latch, and it's going to sit too high, and you'll never be able to get the counting wheel low enough to get the safety selector in. The easy way to tell if you don't know which way it goes, this is the way it goes. That's where your latch rides. But you can see the wear mark right here from where the hammer rides on it and catches. So that's actually the actual surface of the sear. Okay, before we put in the sear that we were just talking about, you want to go ahead and put in the auto sear. And the reason for that is that these little legs right here ride on a space in the frame. They ride on this side of it. They ride up here. If the sear is there, it's really hard to go ahead and get this under the sear and these over at the same time. These are going to want to be pulled down and jammed in, and they won't function right. So it's a lot easier to put the sear in afterwards. And put this full auto sear in first. You see you're not really fighting much. You put your punch in there so you can hold it and line it up. Let's grab the sear pin. Give it a little wiggle. And then we'll just line it up. It's a lot easier to line this up when there's no tension on it. Now, with that there, it's real hard to get the sear in. You'd have this in the way. So there's an easy solution for that. And the easy solution is to grab a tool, and pull this up, and put a punch underneath the legs on the auto sear spring, and that keeps it out of the way. So now when we drop our sear in, we've got plenty of room to work with. Although it's a little harder to get the sear in now, because you can only touch it from the top side. But I'd much rather have trouble dropping the sear in than have to do that with the part in the way. Sometimes you get lucky and they just drop right in. Like that. And now the hard part, because you kind of have to do it blind, is to look in there and make sure that the hole is lined up. And if it is, grab a small hammer. All the while not dropping the sear, and tap it in. It taps right in. Then you can go ahead and remove that. And we have an auto sear. We have most of the parts in there.